Hello, my name is Romulo. I'm a PhD student from Brazil, from Federal University of Ceará. Okay, this is actually my first time presenting in an international conference like uh, this one. Okay, so bear with me a bit, but I hope everything will go smoothly, right? So I'm going to present working paper entitled "Corporate Social Responsibility on Environmental Disclosure, Varieties of Institutional Systems Approach." Okay, so where we want to situate this paper, this work, we have seen that much of the debate concerning the institutional context, how it can shape this CSR practices, it focused on a dichotomy of a liberal versus coordinated market economies because they are focused on developed countries. Okay, so we think that this dichotomy of liberal versus coordinated markets, it's not sufficient to explain CSR practices in developing countries, like is the case of Brazil, for example. Okay, so we have as a research question, we want to see how institutional characteristics can influence the disclosure of social and environmental practices of companies in different developed and developing countries. And we focused on disclosure practices because we think they can show informational demands from stakeholders in these different settings. Okay. So to do that, we have assembled a sample of 85 companies from 8 countries. There is Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, South Africa, South Korea, and United Kingdom from 2007 to 2015 from three industries, that is oil and gas, utilities, and materials. We wanted to focus on environmental sensible industries, so that's why we focus on these three industries. Okay. Uh, we have in total 568 observations from these 8 countries, and here we have the sample distribution for countries and sectors of industries, right? So for each of these companies, we get the sustainability reports, and we evaluated 15 environmental indicators and 16 social indicators from GRI framework, and we used a methodology that was proposed by Fisher and Sokzin in 2013, right? And this would give us a social and environmental disclosure score that would range from 0 to 1. And to explain this score, we used 5 institutional variables that we draw from varieties of institutional systems. There was a paper from Fenschmidt and others from 2018. We tried to, they see the institutional context is composed of 5 roles. We wanted to get as much as variables to represent each role as we could, but we could only get one for each role. Okay, so we have the role of state that we get economic freedom index to represent this role. The role of financial markets that we get financing through equity markets. We have a role of human capital that we get a variable that represents high and inspiring practices in each country. The role of social capital that we get the rule of law from World Bank, and the role of governance, corporate governance, that we got the protection of minority shareholders. Okay. So with these variables, our analysis was conducted in 3 steps. First, we conducted a cluster analysis. We wanted to identify like some country profiles that would represent some sort of institutional complementarity between these 5 roles. Okay, and then we described each cluster regarding the institutional variables and their disclosure practices. And finally, we had two regression models. Okay, in the first one, we wanted to explain disclosure using the 5 institutional variables plus 3 firm control variables. And in the second regression, we included these clusters as interaction variables to see how it could change the relation of each institutional variables regarding the social disclosure. Okay. So here we have the distances for each country in each year. We can see that they arrange themselves in like 4 clusters. We have this blue cluster here, puts together Australia, Canada, and United Kingdom from 2007 to 2009. This would be our more liberal cluster, okay? This red one here, it congregates Germany, South Korea, and United Kingdom from 2010 to 2015. This would be our more coordinated cluster. And we have a green cluster here with Brazil and India, and a yellow cluster with South Africa, right? So we then wanted to understand each of these clusters. So we would see the average of each variable for each cluster. So we can see here that in clusters 1 and 2, they have the highest averages for all the variables except for active market and protection of minority shareholders. The highest average is on South Africa in both variables. And Brazil and India, they have the lowest averages for all variables except for higher and fine practices, that South Africa as well has the lowest values, okay? So we think that this would reflect in their disclosure. We can see here that Brazil and India, the cluster that congregates them, their companies, they have the highest total disclosure index, as well as the highest social disclosure and the highest environmental disclosure, okay? So companies in Brazil and India, for some reason, they disclose more than their counterparts from other countries in our sample, all right? And then we conducted our regression analysis, first without the cluster effects. In the second moment, we included these clusters. First here, we see that there are 3 main variables that were significant to explain the disclosure. There is active market that had a negative influence, and higher and fine practices and rule of law that had a positive influence on the disclosure, okay? And then we included the clusters to see how they would affect these relationships, and I will comment the most significant changes, okay? The first changes that we can see are regarding the active market variable. So we see here, before we had a negative relationship, but when we include clusters to allow the relationship to change among them, we see that in cluster 1, there is the more liberal one, we see that the relationship is actually positive instead of negative, meaning that the easier it is for a company to access the active market, the more they will disclosure their social and environmental practices. While in the other clusters 2 and 4, you have a negative relationship, as well in cluster 3 you have a positive one, but the relationship is only significant in cluster 2. Okay? It's not significant in clusters 3 and 4. Then we have higher and fine practices. Here I'd like to highlight first that, again, the relationship was only significant for clusters 1 and 2. We have a positive relationship for both clusters 1 and 2, but the influence is higher in cluster 1, okay? And the most significant change we could see was in the protection of minority shareholders, okay? This variable wasn't significant in our first model, but when we included the clusters as interaction variable, it became significant in all 4 clusters. But the relationship is negative for cluster 1 for the most liberal countries, like this red line here, and it is positive for all the other 3 countries, or other 2 clusters, okay? So what do you think these results show us? First, they show that in liberal companies operating in liberal markets, their disclosure will be driven by market incentives. They will disclose more when there is more, the active market is easier to access, and they will also disclose more when their shareholder is less protected. So we think that this shows that they the main focus on disclosure social and environmental practices is to reduce the cost of equity, right? While in the coordinated market, or cluster 2, the main driver for the disclosure is a legal requirement. They need to comply with some legal requirement to disclosure more, right? While we also think that the lack of significance in variables for clusters 3 and 4 shows that we need a better framework to explain CSR practices of this country, of companies operating in these countries, that this dichotomy of liberal and coordinated markets doesn't offer so far. Okay, so that's it. I thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you so much, Romila.